Intifada? Let's get educated. I'm interested. I know Intifada stands for like the first uprising of Palestinians against the Jews or some stuff. And they became more and more violent or something. Let's take a look.
The term Intifada and immediately thought of intense bloodshed, suicide bombings, shootings, stabbings.
I feel like the first one wasn't that crazy. I think so. That's what Hassan said. I listened to him. The first Intifada wasn't that crazy, and then it got crazier and crazier. And he argues because Israel also got crazier, stuff like that.
Probably picturing the second Intifada, which began in the year 2000, in which over 1,100 Israelis were murdered, the majority of whom were civilians. But as you may have guessed, if there was a second Intifada, that means there was also a first Intifada. While the first Intifada, which lasted from 1987 to 1993, saw a lower level of violence, it was still a watershed moment in the Arab-Israeli conflict. What was the first Intifada? And how is it different from all other Mideast conflicts, both before and after? By the late 1980s, Israel had fought and won
I can't make it louder, shut up.
wars with the Arab nations surrounding it, and made peace with one of those former enemies, Egypt. But those wars, as difficult as they were, would prove to be far more conventional than the popular Palestinian revolts known as intifadas. Intifada comes from the Arabic word meaning shaking off. It was originally intended by many to mean non-violent resistance to Israeli control over the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, but
it was meant as to be non-violent in the beginning.
So what was going on in Palestinian society in the years leading up to the First Intifada? While the PLO, or the Palestine Liberation Organization, was conducting major terror operations across Israel's borders, Arabs living under Israeli rule in Gaza and the West Bank became restless and increasingly militant. But why was this change happening? Well, some argue that Israel's increased building of settlements, which are communities in the West Bank and Gaza.
And that's a thing that I saw Hassan say. You guys always have an opinion about Hassan. I don't know him well. I watched one stream about Israel last week for 2 hours that he argued and makes sense. An intifada doesn't just happen. It's a very complex thing. It seems like it doesn't just happen because all these Arabs just want to be terrorists and hate so much. It also was for certain parts triggered by certain things like the aggressive settlement in the West Bank after the Six-Day War. There's always two sides to everything. I think that's the point that I'm seeing a bit.
Played a major role. But in his book, Building a Palestinian State, Professor Glenn Robinson, a researcher at UC Berkeley, argues that Israel's policy of promoting higher education in the West Bank also contributed to the conflict. Ironically, by bringing many poorer Palestinians into the educational system, people who held more radical and militant views were now given a space, university campuses, to promote their ideologies.
Oh, shit.
Also, although the standard of living in the West Bank and Gaza had increased significantly under Israeli control, high levels of unemployment still caused great frustration. Many Palestinians also saw the emergence of leftist political groups in Israel as an opportunity to change Israeli policy through demonstrations and achieve an Israeli withdrawal from the territories conquered in the 1967 Six-Day War. But there was another unifying factor to throw into the mix: Arab nationalism. Now, this movement had previously been secular. The PLO charter made no reference to religion, and the dominant factions under the umbrella of the PLO were explicitly secular. But another kind of nationalism,
unimaginable nowadays,
Islamic religion, had always been present in competition with the secular version. Fundamentalist groups like the Muslim Brotherhood, out of which Hamas emerged during the First Intifada, merged religion and the national struggle into an ideology that would energize the masses into action. Hamas, in particular, espoused anti-Semitism in its charter, endorsing the notorious forgery, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, to demonize Jews and Judaism. As Israel entered 1987, the violence and riots increased. It was the 20th anniversary of Israel's conquest of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip in the Six-Day War. Islamic Jihad assassinated an Israeli military police.
Always verify everything you hear from streamers and anyone. Yeah, but what I say is not wrong. I just said there it's a very complex thing. And Israel was very aggressively settling in the West Bank after the Six-Day War. Go verify that, man.
The Israeli security agency, in turn, killed the 6 jihadists involved. A few months later, a terrorist succeeded in penetrating an IDF base, flying on a glider, and killed 6 soldiers.
Jesus.
Morale among Palestinians rose, as did their readiness to stand up to army soldiers. Then, on December 8th, 1987, a tragic event occurred that many point to as the spark that finally ignited the Intifada. An Israeli truck driver crashed into a row of cars containing Palestinian workers at a checkpoint in Gaza. 4 of the workers were killed in the collision, and 7 were seriously injured. Hundreds of other Palestinians returning from work in Israel witnessed the accident. The next day, an estimated 10,000 attended the victims' funerals. Rumors spread alleging that the crash was intentional, an act of revenge for the stabbing death of an Israeli in Gaza 2 days earlier. That day, demonstrations quickly erupted at the Jabalia refugee camp, and protests spread into the West Bank and East Jerusalem. Young people took to the streets, sealing off access to the refugee camps with burning tires and by throwing stones. Store owners closed their shops, and Palestinians who worked in Israel stayed home on strike. Never before had the Arab-Israeli conflict seen this level of demonstrations. Tens of thousands of civilians took part, including women and children. The Intifada was now in full force, taking on a life of its own. So, where was the PLO in all of this? Well, they were actually caught off guard by the popular revolt. A new group of local Palestinian activists emerged from the community to guide the protesters, challenging the PLO's claim to represent the people. An organization called the Unified National Leadership of the Uprising was formed to coordinate activities and to provide social services and makeshift schools when the official school year was suspended. Early on, civil disobedience was the main strategy of the movement. Palestinians working in Israel went on strike. Almost 60,000 Palestinians worked in Israel, so mass strikes effectively shut down Israel's construction industry and impacted agriculture as well. Palestinian businessmen refused to pay taxes to Israel, and consumers boycotted all Israeli goods. The Intifada also caused a 50% reduction in the number of visitors to Israel. All of these factors damaged the economy severely. Although Palestinian groups had, in theory, agreed to refrain from violence, this didn't prevent widespread rock throwing and the use of Molotov cocktails or petrol bombs against Israeli soldiers and civilians alike. Palestinians had no army, so they had to use unconventional weapons, but they were weapons. Israelis remember it as a time when it seemed you couldn't drive on the road without being struck by rocks. Scenes of chaos like these created a sense of panic in Israeli society. Very soon, discipline among the protesters was breaking down, and the old guard of the PLO co-opted the movement. After this point, the Intifada could no longer be called nonviolent. One of the PLO's main roles was instructing people about what level of violence should be used, when it should be escalated, and against whom. Guns, grenades, explosives, some 700 attacks in all were perpetrated against Israeli targets during the first 4 years of the Intifada. So, how did the Israeli government respond to all of this? What tactics could a country like Israel use to combat these threats? What would a victory even look like under these circumstances? These were some of the dilemmas faced by Israeli soldiers during the First Intifada. See, the Israelis were just as surprised by the uprising as the PLO was. This was a situation the IDF had no training for, and they were conflicted over how to respond. They were used to fighting other soldiers, not civilians in densely populated areas throwing rocks and petrol bombs. But Minister of Defense Yitzhak Rabin ordered the IDF to act forcefully in putting down the riots. The Palestinians and those sympathetic to their cause dubbed Rabin as the bone breaker. To try to quiet the riot.
So he was actually like an evil guy. He wasn't the nicest. But then later on, he was too nice for some Jews, and then they assassinated him.
Soldiers fired
because he made the
gas,
Oslo Accords.
Water cannons, rubber bullets, and sometimes even live ammunition when threatened with violence. But without success. There were also beatings, mass arrests, and curfews imposed. And the decision to shut down schools and universities did not have the intended effect of slowing the protests. It just led young people to protest even more. The media coverage proved highly damaging to Israeli public appeal. TV screens across the globe were filled with images of young protesters facing off with heavily armed Israeli police. The demonstrators knew to alert journalists and photographers to scenes of protest. To many, it seemed as if the tiny Jewish nation had become a giant oppressor of the Palestinian people, who were just no match for the IDF. But the Intifada came at a great cost to the Palestinians as well. By the end of the Intifada, some 1,100 Palestinians would be killed in clashes with Israeli forces working to stop the uprising.
Wasn't very non-violent, man. 1,100 dead on both sides. Thank you, Luglust. Thank you.
Accused of collaborating with Israel. In fact, thousands of Palestinians had been working with Israeli authorities, giving valuable information on terror activities. But when threats by the PLO didn't stop their cooperation with Israel, special death squads executed those suspected of collaborating. 2 years into the conflict, 1/3 of the 2,700 attacks carried out by Palestinians were directed at fellow Arabs. Aside from the human toll, the Palestinian economy and society just couldn't bear the prolonged work stoppages and boycotts. The Intifada was losing steam. The First Intifada brought major changes to the political landscape. Before the Intifada, and in its early days, the PLO was at a low point. They had just been expelled from Jordan in the early 70s and had been forced to flee Lebanon in the early 80s. Worst of all, they couldn't show that years of terrorism had produced any positive results. But once the PLO took control over the Intifada,
Palestinians are not really doing well in these last
now, media coverage depicted Palestinians
centuries,
as
man, huh?
not terrorists, and garnered international sympathy for their cause. This, in turn, allowed Yasser Arafat to present a more moderate-looking political program. In November 1989, Arafat decided to go against decades of PLO policy of seeking Israel's destruction and instead recognize Israel and adopt the principle of a two-state solution. Israeli leadership doubted Arafat's sincerity, seeing as the PLO continued to engage in violence. Eventually, though, in May 1989, Prime Minister Yitzhak Shamir and Defense Minister Yitzhak Rabin produced a peace initiative that...
This was like the closest they were to peace, right? Like kind of the closest.
Referred to the Palestinians as its partner in negotiations. The initiative stalled, though, as Palestinian violence continued. But in September 1993, with the signing of the Oslo Accords, the First Intifada finally came to an end, opening the path to peace negotiations. PLO itself committed to reject violence and terrorism, a pledge it did not end up honoring in the coming years, particularly during the Second Intifada of 2000 to 2005.
No, with Trump they are the closest.
During the Second Intifada, over 1,000 Israelis were killed, 78% of whom were civilians. In the end, the Israeli government...
Not a friend of Epstein, Bill Clinton.
...challenge posed by the popular
Epstein is everywhere, man.
But if the IDF's methods proved ineffective for stopping the violence, the media coverage was a disaster. Israel's public image took a huge hit. Before 1967, Israel was seen by the world as David fighting the giant Goliath in the form of the Arab nations arrayed against it. The 1967 Six-Day War may have altered the view of Israel as an underdog, but the tiny country still maintained its reputation of fighting fairly to defend itself in wars it didn't choose. Both before and after its wars, Israel had made several attempts at peace agreements, including territorial compromise. The First Intifada, though, challenged that image. Now, the lightly armed Palestinian public would garner sympathy from the nations of the world, despite terrorist groups like Hamas and Islamic Jihad who still carried out attacks.
This video seems pro-Israel. I feel like this video is anti-Israel. What are you saying?
Occupier by a broader audience. Many Israelis were also disturbed by the optics of the situation. Soldiers fighting terrorists and enemy armies to protect the state had always been a source of pride. But soldiers fighting teenagers, even violent ones, was a jarring and uncomfortable concept for many.
Lucy, are you mentally ill?
From across the political spectrum, now began to debate the morality and ethics of policing a large, hostile civilian population. Today, people remember the Intifada in different ways. For some, it was a time when the Palestinian people rallied together to try to remove the Israeli presence from the West Bank and Gaza. For others, it was a time when the Palestinian people, galvanized by its leaders, engaged in violent and deadly riots, forcing the Israeli military to respond in kind to protect its citizens. In some ways,
25 years later, not much changed, man. Not much changed in 25 years, huh?
She slipped through my fingers like sand. Heard that she got a man. Now I'm just sitting here sad. Oh well, ship sail. She slipped through my fingers like sand.